Okay, we're live. We're live. Welcome, World Wide Web. Welcome, Internet. And hopefully, welcome, students. Hopefully, there are students out there who are watching and listening. This is Stand to Reason's Google Hangout on air. We are calling this one "What Students Are Asking," and doing this in honor of a recent event that we just did. My name is Brett Kunkle. I am the Student Impact Director at Stand to Reason. Former youth pastor, was a youth pastor for 11 years, and have joined Stand to Reason about 11 years ago, working with young people. Love young people. Just got to spend a weekend with over 1,000 young people. And I'd love to know if there's some young people out there, actually whoever's out there watching and listening. We do want to know if you're watching, if you're listening, where you're at, where you're from, what time it is there, what you're eating for dinner, whatever it is. So do me a favor. Either tweet us or leave some comments here on the Google Hangout. I believe there's a place for the comments, right, Brooke? You can somewhere there. I don't know if your screen looks like mine, but somewhere there, let us know where you live. Am I able to see their comments popping up in the questions thing? Oh, if I click on the Q&A. Okay, so I am on the Q&A. So if you're out there, if you're watching on YouTube, just maybe let us know on the in the comment section. I think you can also. Can they also watch on the blog? They could be watching. If you're watching on the blog, leave comments there. Let us know that you're out there, and also tweet us. In fact, that's okay. So tonight's theme is what students are asking. We just this past weekend hosted the 2014 Rethink Student Apologetics Conference here in Southern California, and we had about 1,100 people show up for that. The vast majority were students, but we had youth leaders and parents as well. But it was great to see all the junior hires, the high schoolers, the college students come out for an apologetics conference. In fact, I'm gonna just go ahead and claim this right now. This was the largest youth apologetics conference in the nation. Actually, in the world, maybe, right? Can I claim that? I don't know. I am going to claim it. I asked my buddy Sean McDowell if he knew of another apologetics conference that was big, and he does not know of any. So if Sean said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Anyway, so we had this great weekend, Friday night, Saturday, with thousands of students asking really important, serious, deep questions that they had, dealing with topics that were significant. It was not fluff like so many youth conferences are. So we had beforehand decided we were going to host this kind of Google Hangout in honor of that conference and in honor of the students that went on that conference, and really try to provide another resource for those students to keep asking their questions, to deal with some of the questions that we didn't get to think about how we even answer questions. So we have some questions that we have been collecting from students. Some students have used that super secret hashtag that we gave them, and we've gotten some questions from students. We actually also kind of collected a lot of the questions that students were asking at Rethink, and we have a number of those here to kind of form a base of questions. They kind of gave us a feel for the kind of questions students were asking. But I want to start with one more comment and preface here. We don't plan to answer a ton of questions. There's just so many questions, and I don't want to just simply answer questions for you students. I also want to help you think through questions, think through how to answer them. I want to help you learn how to think along the way. So not just kind of say, okay, here's question 1, here's a pat answer. Here's question 2, here's a pat answer. I want to go a little bit deeper than that. Because I think there's some really important things to keep in mind as you wrestle with your own questions. All right? And, so anyway, I want to start with David, I think it's Scott. Maybe it's Scote. David Scote on Twitter. Scott Boy. He asked a great question using the super secret hashtag. He said, what is the toughest obstacle for a naturalist to overcome in order to consider Christianity or theism? And that's a pretty, it's a great question. Great question. It's kind of a sophisticated question, I think, for maybe a student, but it really gets at, I think, some really important issues here. Okay, so I want to come back and answer the question in a second. What is the toughest obstacle for a naturalist, someone who affirms naturalism, that nature is all that there is, the natural world is all that exists, the material world is all that exists? Okay, that's a naturalist. What's the toughest obstacle for a naturalist to overcome in order to consider theism? Okay, so before I answer that, let me say that one of the bigger questions I think that we got from students at Rethink, and some of the things that have been tweeted in, are questions about Old Testament ethics. So why did God command the death of people in the Old Testament? Why did he have harsh death penalties in the Old Testament? Why, how do you? Oh, this was one. I forgot who tweeted this one in. How do you debunk, quote unquote, Christians are killers without saying it's in the Old Testament, so it doesn't count? Like, how do you you can't just dismiss that. So there was a lot of questions about Old Testament ethics, which does relate, I think, to David's question here, and here's how it relates. And this is one thing, students, I want you to consider as you think through Christianity, as you think through difficult issues, is that you and I have a number of beliefs. Oftentimes we're not even conscious of our whole stock of beliefs, right? Of all the beliefs that we have. It's not like they're always kind of in front of us and we say, yeah, I believe this, I believe that, I believe this, I believe that. Oftentimes they just kind of fade to the background, but they drive other beliefs, or they don't allow other beliefs. And so here's a word I want you to think about, students. Here's two words. I want you to think of a big phrase here: plausibility structure. Plausibility structure. You're like, what? Okay, what's that? All right. So I want you to think in terms of a spider web. Okay. And a spider web. A spider makes this web, and things stick to the web, right? So a fly comes by, he sticks to the web. Okay. In the same way, our beliefs about reality and about the universe form a plausibility structure, meaning it forms we have this web of beliefs, and other beliefs will either stick to that web or they'll bounce off of that web, right? So let me give you an example. What do I mean? Well, let's say I'm an atheist. Okay, well, if I'm an atheist, there's probably a number of other beliefs I affirm. Of course, one of them, if I'm an atheist, is that there is no God, right? God does not exist. Also, kind of related here now to David's question, is that I may have the view, I may hold a view of naturalism. Reality is simply made up of, natural stuff, material stuff, physical stuff. So there's nothing, it's all natural, there's nothing supernatural, right? No God, no supernatural, no angels, demons, things like that. And so that's going to start forming this web of belief. And then when I hear other things come my way, that web will kind of create a stickiness or a lack of stickiness for certain beliefs. That web creates a structure in my mind that either helps me to accept other beliefs or reject other beliefs without even considering maybe the evidence for those beliefs themselves. All right? So, for instance, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that God exists. I believe that everything's supernatural and that there is only there's nothing supernatural. Okay, so then you come to me and you're a Christian and you talk to me about miracle claims. You talk to me about miracles or Jesus rising from the dead or something like that. Or the Bible is the inspired word of God. Now, given my plausibility structure, given the web of beliefs that I have, atheism, naturalism, nothing supernatural. When you say things like the Bible is God's word, Jesus rose from the dead, God loves you, these kind of things, are those ideas going to stick in there? Am I going to be able to really entertain that those things are really reasonable at all or plausible? Am I really going to consider them? No, because I have this plausibility structure that keeps me from really considering the evidence for, these kind of supernatural things. Because my web of belief says, no, there's nothing supernatural, so I have to give some other alternate explanation for these things. Okay, so I had to that's a lot of groundwork to kind of lay there for this issue, this question. And I'm not going to deal with a lot of the Old Testament stuff, but specifics. Here's what I want you students to think about. Even those of you who are Christians, I would guess probably the majority of you who are tuning in are Christians. I want you to think about the idea that you have absorbed a lot of ideas from the culture. You have absorbed a worldview from the culture. Your web of beliefs isn't just something you've kind of consciously built, but oftentimes we simply absorb the ideas of our culture. And so I would guess that many of, and I know this just from experience, many of the students I talk to, actually their worldview is very similar to a worldview without God, a very secular worldview. The secular kind of atheistic views of the culture have seeped into you. And so I hear this when students kind of come to, things in the Bible that maybe seem weird, a little weird. Well, I think they seem weird because you don't have a good web of beliefs that would let you consider things like miracles and resurrections and God's action to be plausible or to be reasonable. You often just adopt and assume ideas that God is very distant, that God doesn't interact much with the world. Much of our life we can actually, as Christians, even live in a very atheistic, godless kind of way without considering that God is interacting in this world. Okay, so when it comes, here's the kind of the payoff. So then when it comes to some of the things that we see in the Bible, Old and New Testament, we have this web of beliefs that makes us look at the Bible and go, that stuff's really weird. That talking animal, a talking donkey in the Old Testament, a flood, animals in an ark, God, being, violent or something like that, on and on and on. A guy rising from the dead, a virgin birth. It creates all these questions like that. Just right from the get-go, it just seems unreasonable. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. I'll hear Christians say it's illogical. Okay. Which, strictly speaking, a lot of stuff is not illogical in that it violates the law of logic. It's just that it sounds crazy to you because you don't have a good web of beliefs. You have a secular web of beliefs that doesn't let these ideas stick. Okay. So, now, back to David's question. All right, so I guess the first thing I want to say, little review here. The first thing I want to say, students, is that some of your difficulty with the questions is that there are these foundational kind of worldview issues, these other beliefs that you have that influence how you see the Bible, how you see the world, how you see reality, how you think about it, what you can even entertain as reasonable or unreasonable. Does that make sense? Yeah, would you shake your head if that makes sense? Okay, I see those heads. All right, now back to David's question. What is the toughest obstacle for a naturalist to overcome in order to consider theism? Well, that's what I think it is. I think it's his plausibility structure. I'll say more about this, but I think it's his plausibility structure. I think he's got, in order to consider theism, he has to go back and deal with these kind of fundamental ideas, these underlying ideas, these assumptions sometimes that he has that don't even allow him to look at miracles, right? So anybody who claims that they were an eyewitness to a resurrected Jesus, well, it couldn't be that, right? Here's my plausibility structure as an atheist, as a secularist. It couldn't be that. So instead, the only thing I'm going to be able to do is I'm going to have to resort to some kind of psychological explanation. Okay, these folks were having hallucinations. They were, some kind of psychological defect here to explain why these people thought they saw a risen Jesus or something like that. You see, and what it does is actually it makes us more closed-minded. So I think for the naturalist, the toughest thing for him to overcome is those kind of foundational worldview issues that create this web of beliefs. And so what you're going to have to do is now, here's the common ground we have. The common ground we have is reality. So if I'm talking to my friend who's an atheist, I've got reality to point to. All right. And so here's what I would do with someone who considers himself a naturalist. The natural world is all that there is. I'm going to point to things that that don't cooperate with that view. There are things in reality that don't cooperate with naturalism, because I don't think naturalism is a proper explanation for the world around us. I don't think it captures all of reality, right? I think there's more than the natural world. I think there's the supernatural world. There's the non-physical world. There's the immaterial world. I do think that things like souls and angels and demons and God and other minds, these things exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to naturalism's inability to explain certain things. So let's just take a human person. Okay, let's just take Brett Kunkle. There are things about me, there are things about you that a naturalistic, atheistic worldview can't, I don't think can explain. So here's one problem: consciousness. How do you get non-physical consciousness? Not just a brain, but consciousness, thoughts and awareness and these kind of things. How about free will? How does a human being, it seems like if they're just a material thing, it's just all cause and effect, then free will goes out the door. And a lot of materialists, naturalists will agree. How about rationality? Where do you get rationality from some irrational source like evolution? How about objective morality? Where do you get that from? How do you get that? Intrinsic value. If we want to affirm that human beings are valuable, how are you going to get that on that worldview of atheism and naturalism? Okay, so those are things I'm going to push on. Say your view as the naturalist can't explain these kinds of things in the world, and then I'm going to push. And then probably where I'm going to start is God's existence, making a case for God's existence. In fact, that's what okay, so a lot of these questions that we have on Old Testament ethics from students, for some of you, I just want you, and if I'm working with my youth group or students, I am going to want to ask questions about their views on God and God's existence, and I'd want to strengthen your views on God's existence. Actually, sometimes before I even get to these specific questions. And that's why when my atheist friends bring up like questions about the Old Testament ethics, I'll often just kind of punt it first and say, well, hold on for a second. You don't even believe that God exists. So I think it's going to be very difficult for you to even consider any of my explanations to be rational whatsoever, because you don't have this fundamental idea that, in place that God exists. So I want to make a case that God exists. Then, if we can make a reasonable case, then we can start looking at these specific things that we say are his actions, these things that he's done. I think making a case that God exists will help strengthen my answer to these other things. Okay, so I know I took a lot of time to answer that, but so for those of you who are parents or teachers or educators or youth leaders that are listening too, I think this is an important thing to consider, and I've been thinking a lot more about this lately, because I think we are in a culture that's dominated by secular thought. So, and a lot of students have simply absorbed it. The church has not done a good job of passing along the faith, passing along the Christian worldview, educating young people in the Christian worldview. So they're going to come at these questions with these kind of assumptions. They're going to make just our answers seem not very satisfying. Does that make sense? And so that's one thing. I think that's one insight, is that it's not just simply about answering this question, giving a pat answer here and a pat answer there. We have to do more work at the worldview level. Okay. All right. I hope that was helpful. Okay, let me look and see. I just want to see if anyone is tweeting in some more questions. Okay, so let's go to some other ones, other specific questions here. I think I've laid some good foundational, some groundwork here. Okay, so another question that I get a lot from students, is the whole question of where did God come from? Okay, so after I do make my case that God exists, students will always ask, well, okay, where did God come from? Was God created? How do we answer that challenge? Because sometimes Christians won't be careful when they make the argument for God's existence. So they say, well, everything needs a cause, therefore the universe needs a cause, and that cause was God, or something like that. And we want to be careful. We don't actually think everything needs a cause. The argument, the Kalam cosmological argument that we use to demonstrate that God exists, says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So, but not that everything and anything needs a cause, but whatever begins to exist needs a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe needs a cause. Okay, so it's just a simple kind of deductive argument. It's valid, and so then the question will come. The follow-up question will be, okay, well, who caused God? Well, number one, when we make that argument, we're not arguing that everything needs a cause. So not everything needs a cause. Specifically, God doesn't need a cause. God, by definition, is an uncreated being. Okay, he's you might say, the first cause. He's the cause that began everything else. Everything else is dependent upon a God. Okay, so first, just get clarification here. God is uncaused. God is by definition uncaused, uncreated. He has always existed. And so the question actually commits a logical fallacy. The question commits what we call a category error. Okay, so you're asking a bad question. You're asking a question of something that doesn't belong in that kind of category of questions. So, for instance, I might say, how long is the taste of an orange? You say, what? How long is the taste of an orange? Well, the taste can't be measured. Or, what is the flavor of the note C? Or how much does the note C weigh? Or things like that. Well, wait a second. Those are bad questions. They're bad questions, and they commit this category error. You're asking a question of something that doesn't fit in that category. So when it comes to God, God is an unmakeable thing. But what we're asking is, who made that unmakeable thing? Who created that uncreated being? God is by definition, if he does exist, he is by definition uncreated, unmakeable. He's always existed. Okay, so that's the first point, is that God has always existed. Number two, the question commits a category error. And let me add on to that, we're not cheating on this. It's not like we're saying, well, God is the only, is the only eternal thing, and Christians just claim this. They're not arguing for it. They just assert it, and so therefore it's true. No, that's not what we're saying here. We're reasoning to this point because it seems to me you've got two options, right? Either things pop into existence out of nothing, or you're going to have some kind of first cause that is uncreated and eternal, that's always existed, right? So either things pop into existence out of nothing. I don't think that's very rational. I don't think that's a good option, right? And a lot of people don't think that's a good option. That's why most people don't believe that. So what's your other option? Well, something eternal, something uncreated has always existed, but that brought everything else into existence. Okay, well, what would that thing have to be like? And this is where you have to be powerful, right? I think it would have to be an agent. I would reason to that. I don't think it could be another event, because all events need causes. Not all agents need causes. So a supernatural agent like God, who is eternal, powerful, timeless, spaceless, could bring the universe and time and space and matter into existence. Right? So I'm reasoning back to God as the best candidate for an uncaused eternal being that brought everything into existence. Okay? So now my atheist friend might say, well, no, it was the universe. Well, there's problems with that. There's the problems of an infinite regress. There's it's not an adequate explanation, or not an adequate candidate. I think you take the universe or God and you kind of weigh them. God seems to be the better explanation. Okay, so that's kind of how I would answer that question. And and that's a big question that students ask all the time. So even in there, notice in answering the question, there's a little bit of thinking that has to be involved. So giving a little bit of logic, helping to see that there are certain questions that are bad questions that commit fallacies. And so this is what I want to do with students, is not just give them a pat answer, but help them to think through, give them the tools of thinking, help them to think for themselves. Okay, I wonder if there's any questions here on the Google list that people are interacting with. That might be good ones to deal with here. Maybe I'll go back to the list here. There's some decent questions there. I'll go back to the list here of questions students asked. It's getting hot in this room. Can I get a fan in here? They're not even paying attention to me now. I was saying, can you get me a fan in here? It's hot in here. No, I'm just kidding. That's fine. I'll suffer for the children. Okay. One question we got was, I think, kind of, what is what's the kind of the nature of the Bible? Is the Bible just a guidebook that wasn't meant to be taken literally? And behind that, I think there's a lot of students who have questions about kind of the nature of the Bible, what the book is about, how does it fit together. I think there's questions of coherence behind the questions that we hear from students about the Bible, right? They're really wondering, how does this all make sense? God has given you students a rational mind. So when you look into this world and you ask questions of how does this make sense, those are good questions. I just want to affirm those questions. You should be asking those questions. How do all these puzzle pieces of reality fit together? Okay, and then when it comes to the Bible, so we've got this collection of books. How does this all fit together? So I think what we have to do, leaders and parents and youth leaders, we've got to help you see how it fits together. We have to help you understand kind of the bigger picture to make this book seem like, not just seem, but help you to understand its coherence. Okay, so is the Bible, there's almost, a false dichotomy here in this question. Is the Bible just a guidebook that wasn't meant to be taken literally? Well, you could have a guidebook that has stuff that you take literally. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. Now, oftentimes when we get these kind of questions, we have to ask follow-up questions, clarification questions. So when someone asks me, do you take the Bible literally? My response first is a question. What do you mean by take the Bible literally? What do you mean by literally? Right? Of course, this is part of the DNA of Stand to Reason. It's the Columbo tactic number one that our founder president Greg has made infamous. Right? The Columbo tactic. And the first Columbo question is, what do you mean by that? It's a clarification question. And so often in students, this is what I want you to do. When you think about things, always ask, okay, what does that mean? Get definitions. Even in your questions that you ask. I mean, sometimes you may ask questions you're not even sure what you're asking because you're not even clear on what these terms are that you're using. So whoever asked this question, I would have said, what do you mean take the Bible literally? And probably they mean something like these are actual historical events. Like a lot of what's recorded in the Bible are real historical events. And it's not just, as opposed to a guidebook that maybe it's got some nice stories, but ultimately it's just a moral guide and that kind of thing. So first, the false dichotomy, it could be both. Second, what do you mean, or actually, sorry, reverse that. The first question would be, what do you mean by literally? If you mean like historical reality or accurate or true or something like that, then I would say false dichotomy. It doesn't have to be either history and fact or a guidebook. I think it's both. I think the Bible is the true story of human history. Of course, it's not comprehensive, but it focuses on God's interaction with people in history. Okay, and so there are historical realities in this book. There are historical facts in this book, and this is verified. And we got other questions in here about how do you verify some of these things. Well, there's two major tests that you would apply to the Bible. There are internal tests to see, is this book internally coherent? Does it make sense? Do the pieces fit together? Like, does it not have, all these contradictory things? Is it coherent? Does it make sense? So those would be some of the internal tests, looking for certain kind of characteristics of a book that's telling the truth. Like, of course, a big one is embarrassing detail or something like that, the historians point to. Then you have external tests, outside things like archaeology, right? The writings of other people from the ancient world, these kind of things. When you start applying those tests to the Bible, you realize, man, this thing, is not merely a guidebook to morality, but it's a guidebook to history. There's a ton of history in it, and so it gives an accurate history of God's interaction, of course, primarily with the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, and His plan, starting with the Abrahamic covenant. Starting with His creation of human beings, the fall, messing things up, corruption. The flood, kind of starting over, continued corruption, and God wanting to then, in Genesis 12, He makes His covenant with Abraham to bless all the peoples of the world. And then the rest of the Old Testament is a story of God trying to work through the nation of Israel to do just that, to carry out this Abrahamic covenant, this promise with Abraham. So, and Israel's history is a failed history in the Old Testament. They're just not able to do it. They're not able to follow and worship the one true God, and they fail. And so what we get from the Old Testament is we do get, I think, literal history, but we also do get guidance. In particular, one of the big parts of the Old Testament, why students, you should know the Old Testament, it's not because it gives us this accurate history, but it shows us God's dealings and interactions with human beings. And so what this does is it tells us a lot about who God is and His nature and character and what He's like. In fact, that is really helpful in dealing with some of these Old Testament ethics questions. Some of the stuff that you see in the Old Testament, oftentimes we'll take bits and pieces from the Old Testament. I heard about the slaughter of the Canaanites, or I heard about this, and God seemed to do this and this bad thing. And without reading all of it carefully and comprehensively, then you start to get this picture formed in your mind like, ooh, the God of the Old Testament is this mean guy, this bad guy, right? Well, if you get the context, no, there's all kinds of stuff in the Old Testament that deals with God's love and His grace. And I mean, gosh, the book of Psalms, David is constantly talking about. I was just reading in Psalm 32 today, where David talks about how blessed is he whose sins or transgressions are forgiven. The confession of sin and the grace of God, and just a picture of just this gracious God who forgives sins. And so, so in the Old Testament, that's we get a picture of who God is, His character, His nature, what He's like. So that's a real important part of the Old Testament. Plus, it gives us the story of human history, creation, the fall, the corruption, God trying to work through human beings who are broken, and then we get to the New Testament. And the New Testament picks up with God's plan to continue to bless the peoples of the world, but to now do that Himself as in the incarnation, right? Jesus takes on human flesh. The second member of the Trinity, God comes down, Jesus comes down, takes on human flesh, lives that perfect sinless life, pays the price, is the sacrifice, is the substitution for our sin, and then rises again to give us new life, and then we have the church. So then we have the church age, and now that's what we're in. And so reading the book of Acts is really important in knowing kind of what our mission is at the church. How do we are in the church? How do we carry that out in this world? What we're to be all about. And so there you have historical stuff, historical material, historical narrative that tells us the reality of human history, what happened 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and then in the early church, and now we're in that age. And so you have this literal historical book that then also is a guidebook that now tells us how we ought to live. There's lots of instruction on how we should live, the kind of things that we believe, how do we interact with one another, how do we interact with non-Christians, how do we interact with Christians. So it's both. That's the nature of the book. So again, stepping back, kind of looking at the big picture here, kind of laying some foundation to be able to answer further questions about the Bible. Okay? So, all right, so that was another student question. All right, here's another one here that I'm going to, two more here that I definitely want to touch on. Can I see the questions that are popping up on the side? I see some of them. How many are there? I don't know if I need, okay, there's, all right, so yeah, let's, John W. asked a question. John, are you a student? Can you tell us if you're a student? Because I did want to give a priority to students' questions, but I thought that this is a good question, and I know we actually had some similar type questions from students. So I'm going to assume, John, that you're a student, because this is a great student question. This is the kind of question students are asking. But John asks, why is relationship with God so different from the rest of our lives? We experience life with our senses, but it seems most people explain relationship with God using feelings or impressions or whatever. Should we be experiencing Him with our senses? Okay, that's a really good question. And that is a question. There's different forms of that kind of question that I think we dealt with at Rethink. Like one of the questions that was brought up, which is I think a related kind of question, similar kind of question, was where is it? Why do we not hear about God performing such amazing miracles that are portrayed in the Bible? Or why does God not appear and interact with people like He did in the Bible? Okay, so kind of a related question. So I'll kind of deal with some of those things. Okay, so relationship with God is different from the rest of our lives. Well, in some ways, I think it's definitely very different. And in that, of course, we are dealing. Okay, so we're talking about relationship. So I'm a person. I'm a human person relating to a divine person. So they're persons. Okay, so here's a similarity: is that there are persons that are relating to one another. Now, of course, it's very different than say a human person relating to a human person, like me relating to my wife, in that I can see her, I can touch her, I can hear her, and I can see her, I can go to her, and see a physical representation. And so there's and I can use my five senses in that. So there's some differences there. But then so I think the differences have to do with the nature of the person that we're interacting with. So it seems to me that even though there are similarities, there's also big differences. Human persons interacting with other human persons versus human persons interacting with a divine person, particularly a person like God. And so a number of thoughts come to mind here. Maybe one of the reasons why it is so different is because God is he's such a radically different being than human beings. He's awesome, such that the human person would be overwhelmed if God just came down and said, bam, here I am. In fact, that's what Scripture indicates, right? In Exodus 33, this is some insight that we get from the Old Testament in God's interaction with human beings. But in Exodus 33, it talks about the kind of the close relationship that Moses had with God. And the way it describes it, it says in verse 33:11, says, "Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend." Now, I think the language here, I think this is an example of what we call a anthropomorphism, where you take human language and use it to describe or explain something about God. I mean, I don't think God actually literally has a face. And Moses was speaking face to face, with God's face or something. God doesn't have a face. God is spirit. John 4:24, those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. But I think this is explaining the kind of closeness that Moses had. But later on it tells us in that text, it says in verse 20, but God said, "You cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live." Then the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand there on the rock. And it will come about, while my glory is passing by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Okay, again, I don't think he literally has a back, but I think here's one of the reasons why we don't experience God with our five senses is because we would die. If God showed up, his presence would be so awesome and overwhelming that a human being would not be able to stand it. And so I think that's one reason that it's different. Now here's a similarity. I think there's communication between persons, right? So I can sit with my wife and we can talk face to face. We can have a conversation. There's different views on how God interacts and how God speaks and hearing his voice and that kind of thing. But I do think that God as a divine person communicates with human persons. And our five senses are brought into that, but it doesn't seem to me that the normal kind of regular course of that is kind of hearing his voice. Like, it just doesn't seem to me to be in the Scripture that there's this normal, everyday, like I'm hearing God speaking audibly to me. And that just is not the testimony of 2,000 years of, I think, Christian history, right? But that doesn't mean there's not communication between these two persons, God and me. The communication primarily does come through, right, the Scriptures. So there is communication, and we do use our senses in terms of reading and hearing his word. But again, there might be a difference in the kind of communication because of the different kind of being that we're relating to, God. And so he's given his communication in written form in the Word of God. So I think maybe that explains some of the differences, why there might be differences, because there's a difference between two human persons who relate to another and maybe a human person and a divine person. Now, the question goes on, says, we experience life with our senses, but it seems most people explain relationship with God using feelings or impressions or whatever. Should we be experiencing with our senses? Well, okay, let me get to that first part. I do think you're right that Christians do talk a lot in terms of feelings and impressions. Actually, I think we do this to a fault, where we talk about faith primarily in terms of feelings. And we actually don't use enough don't know, cognitive language, meaning we'll talk about I experienced God, I felt the Holy Spirit, this and that, but we don't use enough language like kind of couching it in terms of reality, or even logic and rationality, certainly I think that one way that we can know, and again, we have to cash out. We have to ask, what do you mean by feelings and impressions? I think you can have knowledge through direct experience. So I think here's how I would divide up our knowledge with God in terms of kind of our relationship and knowing God. Right? John 17:3 says that eternal life is knowing the one true God. So our knowing God consists of three kinds of knowledge. You have the propositional knowledge about God. And this is probably Christians are really weak in the propositional knowledge. That's why they use the language of feelings all the time, because they don't know very many propositions about God. The propositional knowledge is, here's another way to put it. It's knowing that. It's kind of knowing the facts. So there are all kinds of facts that I can know, all kinds of propositions about God that I can know. So God is all powerful. That's a proposition, and I think that's something that's a true proposition about God. That God is all powerful, and that's something I can know. I have good reason to think that. And so that's one way I know. On a very kind of intellectual level, we can know about God, and that actually does. And see, actually, that doesn't have to do with our five senses. That has to do with our rationality. Five senses is just one way that God has given us to know things about the world, and one way that we can know Him is through sense experience. But another way that we can know it is through our rational mind, our logical mind, and so we can come to reason and discover things about God, right? And so we can know things propositionally. That's some of our knowledge. A second kind of knowledge is not only knowing that, but what we might say knowing of, or knowing about, or knowledge by acquaintance or direct experience. Maybe a way to put it is experiential knowledge. So I can experience God in my life, and there have been times when I've had very deep impressions, or there's been I don't know how else to describe it, but like a quickening of my spirit, or just a kind of a passion, or just kind of getting lit up, or emotions, overcome with emotions that I attribute to the Holy Spirit or something like that. And so I can have that direct experience. In fact, the New Testament does talk about the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit, that we can experience that, and that's another way of knowing God. And so you have propositional knowledge, and that comes a lot through study, reading God's Word, and then there is an experience. So I think what we need to do is we need to have a balance. We should talk about the impressions, we should talk about the feelings, but if that's all that we talk about, then we're missing a huge other part, and that's the propositional knowledge of God that comes through the study and the reflection and the rationality. So actually, should we be experiencing with our senses? Yes, but we should also be experiencing with our minds. We should also be experiencing Him more intellectually than we do. And I actually think there's interplay. And this kind of goes back to like our web of beliefs that I talked about earlier in the broadcast. The more true propositions you have about God and His existence and His nature, I think that will then open us up more to being able to experience Him. And so one of the questions I mentioned that students are asking is, why does God not appear and interact with people like He did in the Bible? This is a question that a lot of American Christian students are asking because they don't see God acting in their lives, or their parents' lives, or their youth pastors' lives, or the lives of the people in church around them. Number one, we're not sharing those things. We're not sharing things, miraculous things that happen. So then it just kind of seems like nothing miraculous happens. But I know people who will pray for specific things, or healings, or that kind of stuff. God is working. So my answer to that question would be, well, God is working, but we may not be as open to it because of our beliefs, because of our web of beliefs. We may not be open to it as much, so that therefore we may miss it. We may not recognize it. We may not see it. We may suppress it in different ways. And I would say, gosh, one of the things that's important for us to do is get out of our culture. Not necessarily go to another culture, but if you can, that's great. And students, that's one thing I'd encourage you to do, is get out of American culture, go serve on a mission, hear about what's going on in other parts of the world. I mean, the reports out of Muslim countries is amazing. And I'm so bummed because I had an email newsletter from somebody who is a part of crew, and talking about just some miraculous stuff, specific details of things that were happening in Muslim countries. Pretty amazing stuff. So God is, He is appearing and interacting with people like He did in the Bible. Okay, so then back to John W.'s question. Yeah, should we be experiencing with more with our senses? Yes, I think we should. But I think a lot of our beliefs undercut, or a lot of our rational, intellectual stuff undercuts our experience of them as well. Okay, so yeah, and I think that's an important question that students are asking, because some of us in the apologetics world, we have to be careful. Apologetics is not the end-all be-all. Just giving kind of these, good evidences and answers, as important and vital as that is, it's not the whole thing. And so students need that. It's vital. They need that. But they also need to see this lived out in reality. They need real-life examples of you and me living this out, and seeing this God who I can give an argument that exists and is real, seeing His action in the world as well, helping them to identify that. Okay. All right, let me go with one last question, because an hour's already passed by. Gosh, it's easy to talk. Speak. All right, so I'm gonna take this one last question. I think it's showing up here on the Google Hangout, and this actually comes from Sean Granis. How can I get our church more engaged in youth apologetics? Short of flying our youth group to the Rethink conference, maybe next year, are there other resources, approaches, strategies you can just suggest? Well, if you can fly out or drive out for the Rethink conference, I would suggest it. In fact, we had people fly in from Alaska, from Idaho, from Minnesota. We had youth groups drive in from Arizona, Northern California. Past conferences, we've had people from Nebraska, Nevada, even Canada. Dad and his sons flew down from Canada. So people do come out. We're hoping, we're in the work, we're doing some work right now, and hoping to be able to take that conference around the country. We've had just such a great response. I mean, when you have almost 1,000 students show up for an apologetics conference, that tells you something. They're hungry for this. We definitely need to get over our postmodern hangover. People who don't think that, say that students don't, they're not into apologetics. Yes, they are. Here we had 1,000 students for a conference. So we're hoping to do that in other parts of the country. Hopefully we'll maybe come to the south, kind of middle of the country, and the East Coast. So there you go, Sean. Hopefully we'll be coming close to, we'll be somewhere near you, so you can come to a Rethink conference. But how do you get your students engaged in youth apologetics? Well, one thing you got to do is, and this is what we learned just from Rethink, and this is why a lot of the students that were at Rethink is because their leaders bought into it, their parents bought into it. So I would say, number one, you got to get your youth pastor bought into this. He's got to see the importance of it. You got to get the gatekeepers to see the importance of youth apologetics. Some ways you can do that is by pointing to the statistics, pointing to specific individuals that have gone through your church's youth ministry and have walked away. Look at the data on students who walk away from the church during college or high school. Quote from the professors who are saying, when your kid comes to my class, I'm going to tear him apart. and that's the material in my talk, Who's Waiting for Your Kids. It's a wake-up call. So you got to figure out ways to wake up those gatekeepers. And one of the best ways to get youth apologetics into your youth groups or your churches is by getting the youth pastors, the youth leaders, the gatekeepers, the pastors, the Sunday school teachers, the small group leaders to buy into it. Okay? Role play. That's where I role play a Mormon. I role play an atheist. And I'd love to do it in front of youth pastors so they sit there and squirm and realize my kids don't know anything. Okay? So those are ways you can convince the gatekeepers. But then I think then number one, you have to give them good content. So here's a great resource. In fact, I forgot to bring it to hold it up, but the Rethink DVDs. If you go to our website, str.org, we've got Rethink DVDs from last year's conference. So we have a video of the guys who spoke to our students, who I think are good communicators, who can communicate at a youth level. We got video of that. Show that to your students. There are some great resources, because you don't want to bore them with apologetics if you're not a very good communicator, but take advantage of all the resources that are out there, and some people who I think who can communicate this stuff in very relevant ways, accessible ways. So go to our website, get the Rethink DVDs from last year. We're in the process of producing the new DVDs from this year. So that's one resource. You got to go to my buddy Frank Turek. You got to go to his website, crossexamine.org. Go to his website and get the DVD curriculum, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's 9 DVDs, and then there are student workbooks, and there are leader workbooks. And you plug it in, and you play it, and then you go through the workbook. It's all done. It's all set up for you, and you facilitate the conversation, but you let Frank do the teaching, and he's a great teacher. And that's a very simple strategy that you can do. You can plug it into any kind of program you already have. So it's a Sunday school program, there's 9 weeks of teaching. It's a small group, there's 9 weeks of teaching. You got a couple months covered, right? So those would be some resources. So the Rethink DVDs, the cross-examine stuff. In terms of kind of approaches, what I think we needed to be doing by the time they're in junior high is they by 5th grade, they need to start getting apologetic training. And of course, it's at a more basic level at first, but 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, they're getting apologetics. They're getting it fed to them regularly because they're starting to think critically and logically. So you give it to them nice and young, and that just builds a foundation for future training. But by the time they're in high school, you continue to do the teaching and the training. You teach them what we believe and why we believe it. So you give them theology and apologetics. And this is what I mentioned to the parents and leaders at Rethink this last week. If I could redo my youth ministry days, I'd throw out all the practical how-to stuff that I taught my students, like how to have a better relationship with your parents. And I would focus on theology and apologetics. And then I would draw out those implications, but using theology and apologetics. I would give them good theology and apologetics. That's what I'd focus on in the limited amount of time I had with students. And when this is what I did in youth ministry, is I figured out ways to get them out of the classroom and into real life. So if I'm going to teach on Buddhism, I'm arranging a tour of the local Buddhist temple, or I'm bringing in a Buddhist monk, or I'm bringing in a Mormon, or I'm getting my kids out there in the world by the time they're in high school, or I'm bringing people in, and I want real life interaction. I want them to now have to engage and speak with people who don't believe what they believe. And that's one of the, I think, best approaches and strategies you can use. I've seen it be effective. The most effective training that I do through Stand to Reason are the mission trips that we do. In fact, we'll throw up a link to the mission trips there for you, Sean, that you can take a look at. We have video of some of that stuff. But the mission trips are huge, because what we do is it gets all that training out of the classroom and into real life. We take students to Berkeley, throw them in front of atheists, make them go talk to college students who are non-Christians. Go to Utah and make them talk to Mormons. Go talk to BYU students. So those are the kind of approaches that I'm working on, that I use. Okay. So all right. So I threw in one question there for the adults and parents and who are listening. All right, in terms of how do we do this. Okay, so, well, gosh, an hour flew by. I know we didn't cover a ton of questions. That wasn't my goal tonight, was just to answer a bunch of questions. But I want you to think carefully about your questions. And for those of us who are helping students answer questions, well, I think we have more work to do in our cultural context. I think there's a number of challenges that make it difficult to answer students' questions. Very simply, there's all kinds of assumptions that aren't shared anymore. There's all kinds of worldviews and webs of belief that keep students from really letting those answers stick. So we got to do some foundational work so that these answers stick a little bit more. But then we have to carve out space. Got to carve out space so that students feel comfortable and free to answer these questions. That's what we did at Rethink. We got a ton of questions. Nothing was off the table. We didn't question their faith or their devotion to God because they were asking questions or because they were struggling with doubt. We gave them space to do that. And that's one of the biggest takeaways. That's what we wanted to do here, is give students space to ask questions, to think about some of the most significant issues in life here, and keep asking those questions. Okay? All right. It was fun interacting with you, even though I did all the talking. We'll do this again, and hopefully have another Rethink event, or another what students are asking after maybe our next Rethink conference. But connect with us. Connect with me on Twitter, Instagram, our blog, Facebook, whatever. Connect with us. We'll constantly be putting out resources. We are going to take kind of some of the stuff here that we've covered. We're going to put it on our blog. We're going to tweet out resources. So hopefully this conversation will keep going. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time.